Baby screamed non-stop on a stagecoach until a widow did the unthinkable for a rich duke. The baby's scream cut through the stagecoach like a knife through butter, high, relentless, the kind of cry that made every passenger's jaw clench tighter with each passing mile. Miriam Hale sat in the corner, her morning dress neat despite the rain spattering through the coach's worn leather curtains, and watched a well-dressed gentleman try desperately to soothe an infant who would not be soothed. Hello, lovely. If you're enjoying this tale of courage, unexpected kindness, and second chances that arrive in the most unlikely moments, I'd be so grateful for a like or subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories of dignity, redemption, and love that grows from the smallest acts of decency. And if you're up for it, tell me in the comments, would you have done what Miriam did? I read every note and it always brings a smile to my face. 1. The stagecoach lurched through another rut, throwing passengers against each other. The baby's screams intensified, if such a thing were possible. Miriam had been listening to the child cry for the better part of an hour, watching the man holding him grow increasingly desperate. He was clearly quality, his coat was expensive despite being rumpled, his boots were good leather, and his hands, though awkward with the infant, were gentleman's hands. But he held the baby like someone who'd never held one before, all stiff arms and uncertain bouncing that only made things worse. For God's sake, snapped a ruddy-faced gentleman across from Miriam. Can't you quiet that creature? Some of us are trying to travel in peace. I'm trying, the well-dressed man said, his voice tight with exhaustion. He won't settle. Perhaps you shouldn't be traveling with an infant if you can't manage one, a pinch-faced woman added, her tone suggesting she'd found the man morally deficient. The child is clearly hungry, another passenger offered unhelpfully. Or wet. Or ill. You should check. The man's face showed he'd checked everything multiple times and found no solutions. Miriam watched the scene with the careful assessment of someone who'd learned to read situations quickly. The gentleman wasn't the child's father, that much was clear from his discomfort. An uncle, perhaps? A guardian of some sort? And he was traveling without servants, which suggested he didn't want attention. The baby's cries grew more desperate. A thin, reedy wail that spoke of exhaustion and confusion. The infant didn't understand why familiar arms weren't holding him, why nothing felt right, why the world had suddenly become all wrong. Miriam made a decision. She leaned forward slightly. May I? The man looked at her with something close to desperation. Please. She moved across the cramped coach space and took the baby with practiced ease. The child was perhaps 4 months old, swaddled too tightly in expensive linen. Miriam loosened the blankets, checked the pins all fine and repositioned the infant against her shoulder, one hand supporting his head, the other patting a steady rhythm against his small back. She began to hum. An old hymn her own mother had sung, the melody low and repetitive. The baby hiccuped, drew breath for another scream, and wailed even louder. Well, that's done nothing, the ruddy-faced man announced with satisfaction. Give it a moment, Miriam said calmly, continuing to pat and hum. The baby screamed against her shoulder, but she didn't panic, didn't rush, just maintained the steady rhythm and soft sound. The pinch-faced woman sniffed. Clearly the child needs his mother. Where is she? The gentleman's face closed off. Unavailable. How convenient, someone muttered. The coach jolted to a stop. Through the rain-streaked window, Miriam saw a toll gate and a uniformed official approaching with a lantern. Her stomach sank. Toll officials had a reputation for being suspicious of everything, and a crying baby was exactly the kind of thing that drew unwanted questions. The official opened the coach door, bringing a gust of cold rain. His eyes swept the passengers, lingering on the well-dressed man holding, or rather, standing near a screaming infant. Tolls paid, the driver called from his seat. But the official wasn't interested in the toll. His eyes had sharpened with suspicion. Whose child? The gentleman straightened. Mine. And where's the mother? A pause too long. The baby screamed as if on cue. The mother is dead. Run off. Or did you take the child from her? The official's voice carried the tone of a man who'd found something irregular and was going to make the most of it. I'll need to see papers. Proof of guardianship. Can't have children being trafficked along coaching routes. The other passengers shifted uncomfortably. Some looked interested in the drama. Others looked ready to swear they'd suspected something wrong all along. The gentleman's face had gone pale. Whatever papers he had, Miriam suspected they weren't readily available or weren't the kind that would satisfy a suspicious official looking for bribes or importance. Miriam felt the weight of the moment. She could stay silent. This wasn't her problem. This man and this child were strangers. Getting involved would cost her. But the baby in her arms was real. The official's suspicion would turn this child into a spectacle. They'd be delayed for hours, possibly taken to the local magistrate. The baby would cry the entire time, cold and hungry, and passed between strangers like evidence. She stepped forward, her voice steady. "I'm the child's mother." The coach went absolutely silent except for the baby's cries, which were already beginning to soften now that he'd exhausted himself. The official turned to her, surprise flickering across his face. "You are." "I am." Miriam met his eyes calmly. "My husband and I were traveling when the baby took ill. We stopped for him to rest while I continued with our son. I apologize for the disruption. It was a simple lie. Delivered without drama or embellishment. Just a tired mother explaining a situation." The official studied her widow's weeds, respectable bearing, the natural way she held the now quieting infant. Then he looked at the gentleman, clearly wealthy, clearly out of his depth with childcare. "The husband," the official prompted. "I am," the gentleman said quickly, catching on. The official seemed to weigh whether pressing further was worth his time. A respectable widow, a wealthy husband, a crying baby that was now finally settling, nothing scandalous enough to justify delay. "See that the child is kept quiet," he said finally, stepping back. "Other passengers have paid for a peaceful journey." He closed the door. The coach lurched forward. Miriam sat back down, the baby now snuffling against her shoulder, his cries reduced to exhausted whimpers. Her hands trembled beneath her shawl, but she kept her face composed. The other passengers stared. The ruddy-faced gentleman who'd been so annoyed suddenly looked uncertain. The pinch-faced woman's eyes had gone calculating. A widow claiming a child that clearly wasn't hers meant only one thing in proper society's mind: disgrace. The well-dressed gentleman, her supposed husband now, looked at her with an expression Miriam couldn't quite read. Shock, certainly. Gratitude, perhaps. And something else. Recognition of what she'd just done. What she'd just sacrificed for a stranger. "Why would you do that?" he asked quietly, his voice meant only for her. Miriam looked down at the baby, who was finally settling into sleep against her shoulder. She thought about all the easy answers she could give. Kindness. Christian duty. Simple decency. Instead, she told him the truth. Because he's a baby. And that official was going to turn him into a problem instead of a person. Across from them, the pompous gentleman who'd been complaining cleared his throat awkwardly. "How admirable, madam." His voice suggested he'd swallowed something sour. Such maternal dedication. The words were meant to be polite. But Miriam heard what he wasn't saying. She just painted herself as a fallen woman in the eyes of everyone in this coach. A widow who'd had a child out of wedlock, traveling with a wealthy man who clearly wasn't her husband despite her claims. The baby sighed in his sleep, his small fist curling against Miriam's shoulder. She'd done the unthinkable. And she'd do it again if she had to. But as the coach rolled on through the rain toward the next posting inn, Miriam allowed herself one moment of fear. She'd just set fire to her reputation to save a stranger's secret. And she had no idea what the cost would be. 2. The posting inn appeared through the rain like a promise: warm lights, smoke rising from chimneys, the blessed relief of solid ground. The coach pulled into the yard with a final lurch that woke the baby, who immediately began to fuss. Miriam climbed down carefully, still holding the child. The gentleman, she still didn't know his name, offered his hand to help her navigate the muddy yard. His grip was steady, and he kept himself positioned between her and the other passengers in a way that suggested protection. Inside, the inn was warm and bustling. The innkeeper's wife, a plump woman with kind eyes and too many opinions, descended on Miriam immediately. "Oh, you poor dear. Traveling with a baby in this weather, and him crying the whole way, I'll wager. They do that at this age. She hustled Miriam toward the fire. Sit yourself down. I'll bring broth. You look exhausted, and no wonder a mother's work is never done, especially when they're teething. Miriam opened her mouth to, what? Correct her. The lie had taken root already. Thank you, she managed. That's very kind. The gentleman approached the innkeeper, already pulling out his purse. A private parlor, if you have one available. The flash of gold coins made several heads turn. The innkeeper's expression shifted from respectful to obsequious. Of course, sir. Right away, sir. The Rose Parlor is available, our finest. And will madam be requiring a room as well, or will you be sharing? The question trailed off suggestively. Miriam felt her face heat. The gentleman's voice turned cold. Separate rooms. The best you have. Of course, of course. The innkeeper bowed, already calculating how much he could charge. While the arrangements were made, Miriam sat by the fire, rocking the fussing baby. She caught the innkeeper's wife whispering to a maid, both glancing at her with expressions that mixed pity and judgment. The stable boy, passing through with luggage, whispered something to another servant. Within minutes, the whispers had spread. A widow traveling with a gentleman, claiming his baby, separate rooms but clearly together. At this age, Miriam thought, you don't fear thunder. You fear whispers. A respectable matron seated near the fire moved pointedly to another chair, gathering her skirts as if Miriam's presence might contaminate her. The message was clear. Once they were alone in the private parlor, properly chaperoned by the half-open door and passing servants, the gentleman finally introduced himself. Duke Alistair Hawthorne. His voice was formal, but his eyes were exhausted. And I owe you an explanation and an apology. Miriam Hale. She adjusted the baby in her arms. And you owe me the truth, Your Grace. Who is this child? Alistair sank into a chair, the weight of everything seeming to crash down on him at once. My nephew. My brother and his wife died 3 weeks ago, carriage accident. The baby is all that's left. His voice cracked slightly. There's a dispute over inheritance. My brother's wife's family wants custody, not because they love the child, but because controlling him means controlling the fortune he'll inherit. Miriam listened, piecing together the story. So you're moving him quietly, keeping him away from those who'd use him. Yes. But I'm making a disaster of it. Alistair gestured helplessly. I've never cared for an infant. I don't know what I'm doing. I thought I could manage the journey alone, without servants who might talk, but he stopped. But then you saved us. Why? I told you. He's a baby. You ruined your reputation for a baby you don't know and a duke you'd never met. Miriam looked at the sleeping infant. My reputation was already that of a poor widow. This just makes it a different kind of poor widow. Either way, I'm not invited to tea with the vicar's wife. She meant it lightly, but Alistair's face showed he understood what she'd lost. Respectability was currency, especially for women. She'd just spent hers on him. Let me pay you, he said. For your trouble. For what you've done. No. The word came out sharper than she intended. I didn't do it for money. I did it because that official was going to make a spectacle of this child. Money doesn't undo that. Then what can I do? Miriam thought carefully. If we're going to continue this pretense, and I assume we must, since changing our story now would make everything worse, then you need to treat me with visible respect. Not as a servant. Not as a secret. If people are going to assume I'm... She searched for a delicate word, compromised, then at least let them see you value me. Alistair's respect for her visibly increased. You're negotiating. I'm protecting what's left of my dignity, Your Grace. If I'm to be seen with you, it won't be in shame. He nodded slowly. Agreed. Though I'd like to offer something more substantial when we reach my estate. A position, perhaps. Something that gives you security without obligation. We'll discuss that when, if we arrive safely. A knock interrupted them. A messenger, mud-splattered and urgent, handed Alistair a sealed letter. The Duke read it, his face draining of color. "What is it?" Miriam asked. "A warning. From my sister. Someone's already searching the coaching routes. A man traveling with a baby. They know we're out here." He looked at Miriam, and she saw real fear in his eyes. "Mrs. Hale, you're not just tangled in gossip anymore. You're in danger." Miriam looked down at the sleeping baby, so small and innocent in her arms. Then back at the Duke, who was offering her an escape she suspected he couldn't really provide. "Then we'd better be convincing," she said quietly. "Because that official believed I was this child's mother. Let's hope the next person who asks believes it too." Outside, rain hammered the inn's roof. Inside, the fire burned warm. And Miriam Hale, widow and needleworker, tried not to think about how quickly a life could change. How quickly a single act of kindness could become a knot you couldn't untangle. If you're enjoying this story, I'd be so grateful for a like and subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories you'd love. 3. The morning coach was less crowded, a mercy, given everything. Miriam climbed aboard with the baby, now named in her mind as Thomas because she needed to call him something and the Duke had mentioned his brother's name once. Duke Alistair, she couldn't quite think of him informally yet, despite their strange intimacy, sat beside her, close enough to appear protective but far enough to maintain propriety. Or what was left of it. The baby fussed immediately as the coach jolted into motion. Miriam noticed Alistair's hands, resting on his knees, trembling slightly when he thought no one was watching. "Give me your hand," she said quietly. He looked at her, surprised. "Your hand," she repeated. "Like this." She demonstrated the gentle bounce and sway motion that mimicked a mother's walking gait. Babies remember being carried in the womb. The movement soothes them. It's rhythm they want, not stillness. Alistair tried, his movements jerky and uncertain. Thomas wailed. "Not like you're trying to shake water off him," Miriam said, a smile tugging at her lips despite everything. "Like you're rocking a boat. Steady. Predictable. I'm terrible at this. You're learning. There's a difference." She adjusted his arms. "And don't panic when he cries. Babies cry. It's their only language. You can't take it personally. How do you know all this?" Miriam's smile faded slightly. "I had a child once. A daughter. She died at 2 years old. Fever." The words came out flat, practiced. She'd said them enough times that they'd lost their ability to destroy her. "Almost. My husband died 6 months later. They said it was his heart, but I think it was grief." Alistair was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry. So am I. Every day." Miriam took the baby back, settling him against her shoulder. "But grief doesn't get to steer the carriage. You learn to sit beside it and keep moving anyway." The Duke's expression showed understanding born of his own recent loss. "My brother was my closest friend. We fought terribly when we were young, but as adults." He stopped. "I keep thinking I should have visited more. Should have said more. Should have known his wife's family would do this." "You can't predict cruelty," Miriam said. "You can only respond to it." They fell into comfortable silence, broken only by Thomas's intermittent fussing. Miriam taught Alistair the art of patience, not trying to fix every cry immediately, but learning to distinguish between different types of discomfort. Then Thomas did something unexpected. Alistair was attempting a lullaby, terribly off-key and with dubious lyrics about hunting, and the baby stopped mid-fuss, stared at him with solemn eyes, and let out a small, hiccuping laugh. The sound transformed the Duke's face. He laughed. He did. Miriam felt her own smile widening. "First happy sound I've heard from him." "Sing it again," Thomas seemed to demand with his bright eyes. Alistair obliged, his terrible singing now accompanied by exaggerated facial expressions that made the baby laugh again. The sound was pure joy, and for a moment, the weight of their situation lifted. "You're not going to be your father," Miriam said quietly, watching them. Alistair's singing stopped. "How did you know I was worried about that?" "Because every parent worries about becoming their parents. The good ones, anyway. The fact that you're afraid of being cold and distant means you won't be. My father never laughed with me. Never sat on floors or sang terrible songs. He was the Duke. I was the heir. That was the extent of our relationship. Then be different, Miriam said simply. Thomas won't remember the inheritance or the title. He'll remember whether you made him feel safe. Movement outside the window caught Miriam's attention. A rider, keeping pace with the coach but never quite passing or falling behind. She'd noticed him an hour ago and dismissed it. Now, watching him maintain the exact same distance, something cold settled in her stomach. Your Grace, she said quietly. Don't look immediately, but there's a rider behind us. He's been following us since the last stop. Alistair's casual glance was well practiced. I see him. He's tracking us. Yes. The Duke's jaw tightened. Someone from Margaret's family, most likely. My sister-in-law's relatives. What do? We outsmart them. Alistair leaned forward, calling up to the driver. We'll stop at the next coaching inn. Longer break than usual. At the crossroads inn, larger, busier than the last, they executed a plan born of desperation and Miriam's practical thinking. While Alistair made a show of ordering food and rooms, Miriam noticed the servants' entrance, the cluster of waiting coaches, the general chaos of travelers coming and going. Can you manage the baby alone for 20 minutes? She asked. I'll have to. They split up, Alistair heading toward the private parlors with Thomas, Miriam circulating through the public rooms, her morning dress and respectable bearing making her nearly invisible in the crowd. She bought passage on a different coach, claimed it loudly enough to be overheard, then quietly arranged for their actual coach to continue without fanfare. When the rider arrived, dusty and alert, he went directly to the innkeeper asking about a gentleman with an infant. Ah yes, sir. They've taken rooms for the night. Resting, I believe. The rider settled in to wait, ordering ale and taking a seat where he could watch the main stairs. 2 hours later, Alistair and Miriam were 5 miles away on a different coach, Thomas sleeping peacefully between them. The rider would eventually realize his quarry had slipped away, but by then, they'd have a significant lead. You're good at this, Alistair observed. At what? Staying calm when everything's chaos. At thinking clearly when panic would be easier. I had to be, Miriam said. When my daughter was dying, panicking didn't help her. When my husband's heart gave out, falling apart didn't bring him back. You learn to function through fear because the alternative is giving up. At the next stop, smaller, quieter, the innkeeper greeted them warmly until he looked more closely at Alistair. Your Grace. The man's eyes went wide. The Duke of Hawthorne. I didn't recognize you in, he stopped, clearly realizing that mentioning the Duke's disheveled, travel-stained appearance might be impolitic. Every passenger turned to stare. Miriam's stomach sank. Privacy was gone. The carefully maintained anonymity that had protected them shattered. Thomas chose that exact moment to spit up on Alistair's already ruined cravat. White milky liquid spread across the expensive fabric in an impressive arc. The Duke looked down at the mess, then at Miriam, then at the gawking crowd. Miriam felt laughter bubble up despite everything. There. Now you look like every other man who's ever tried to pretend he's got it handled. Alistair's mouth twitched. Then he laughed, a real, genuine sound that made Thomas startle and stare. I suppose dignity was always going to be the first casualty, the Duke said, dabbing ineffectively at his ruined cravat. But as they moved through the inn, Miriam felt eyes following them. Whispers spreading. The Duke of Hawthorne, traveling with a widow and a baby, looking decidedly uncivil. By morning, all of London would know. And they were still 2 days from Hawthorne Estate. 4. Hawthorne House rose out of the countryside like something from a painting, all grey stone and tall windows, imposing in a way that made Miriam's stomach clench with anxiety. This was where reality would catch up with the story they'd been telling. The carriage rolled to a stop. Alistair climbed down first, then turned to help Miriam, who was managing Thomas with practiced ease now. The baby had finally adapted to her arms, even beginning to smile when she appeared. The household staff assembled on the steps looked like a wall of judgment dressed in black and white uniforms. At their head stood a woman Miriam immediately recognized as troubled, tall, grey-haired, with the kind of rigid posture that spoke of decades maintaining standards. Your Grace. The woman's voice was frost-given sound. "We were not expecting company. Mrs. Brackett." Alistair's tone was measured. "This is Mrs. Hale. She's been instrumental in keeping Thomas safe during the journey. She'll be staying as our guest." Guest. Mrs. Brackett's eyes traveled over Miriam's worn morning dress, the baby in her arms, the implications hanging thick in the air. How unexpected. Miriam felt the dismissal in every syllable. She'd been a servant in households before, knew the hierarchy, understood she was being assessed and found wanting by this woman whose entire identity was tied to maintaining proper order. "Mrs. Brackett, I don't expect," Miriam began. "Mrs. Hale has been caring for my nephew under extraordinarily difficult circumstances," Alistair interrupted, his voice carrying ducal authority now. "She will be treated with respect and given accommodations appropriate to an honored guest. Is that understood?" A pause, waited with resistance. Then, "Of course, Your Grace." But as Miriam was shown to her room, nice enough, but notably in the guest wing rather than family quarters, she felt the household's judgment like a physical weight. Maids whispered. Footmen stared. Mrs. Brackett's disapproval was a constant, cold presence. Miriam had bathed Thomas and settled him in the nursery when a knock came. A woman stood in the doorway, tall, dark-haired, with Alistair's eyes and a face drawn with exhaustion and grief. "So you're the widow my brother rescued," she said without preamble. "Lady Selwyn, I presume." Miriam kept her voice steady. "Correct." Lady Selwyn entered without invitation, circling Miriam like a cat assessing prey. "You claimed to be Thomas's mother on a coaching road. You've traveled alone with my brother for 3 days. You've ruined your reputation and possibly his. I need to know, are you an opportunist or just foolish?" The bluntness was refreshing after Mrs. Brackett's icy courtesy. "Neither," Miriam said. "I'm someone who saw a baby about to become a scandal and chose to prevent it. At great cost to yourself." "Yes." Lady Selwyn studied her with sharp intelligence. "My brother says you're competent. That you know babies. That you handled yourself with remarkable calm under pressure." "I do. I did." "Why? What do you want?" "Nothing," Miriam said honestly. "Except perhaps to ensure Thomas doesn't end up as a prize in someone else's inheritance battle." Something shifted in Lady Selwyn's expression. "You know about Margaret's family. Your brother told me. They want custody for the money. They want custody because they're vultures." Lady Selwyn's voice turned bitter. "And they're already circling. My sister-in-law's brother arrived in London yesterday, already filing papers, already spreading stories about Alistair's unsuitability as guardian. That night, Thomas developed a teething fever. Nothing dramatic, just the normal misery of an infant in discomfort, but combined with the stress of travel and change, the baby wouldn't settle. Miriam sat in the nursery rocking him, humming the same hymn she'd used on the coach. Alistair appeared around midnight, still dressed, clearly unable to sleep. "How is he?" "Uncomfortable but not dangerously ill. It's his teeth coming in. And everything's unfamiliar. He misses his mother." Miriam's voice softened. "He doesn't understand she's not coming back." Alistair sat in the chair beside her. Together they managed the long night, walking Thomas, changing him, coaxing medicine down his throat, taking turns rocking while the other rested. Around 3 in the morning, with Thomas finally sleeping against Alistair's shoulder, the Duke spoke quietly. "I never wanted children. It seemed like too much responsibility, too much potential to fail them the way I felt failed." He adjusted his grip on the sleeping baby. "But now that I have him, the thought of losing him to people who see him as property rather than person." "You won't," Miriam said firmly. "We won't let that happen. We." Alistair smiled slightly. "You've made his cause yours. He's a baby who lost his parents. That's everyone's cause. Or it should be." As dawn broke, Thomas finally settled into deep sleep. Alistair carried him to the nursery crib, tucking him in with a tenderness that made Miriam's chest ache. "You're going to be a good father to him," she said quietly. "I'm going to try." They left the nursery together, both exhausted. In the corridor, they encountered Lady Selwyn, who took in their disheveled appearances and the intimacy of their exhaustion with calculating eyes. "Mrs. Hale," she said. "A word, please." In Lady Selwyn's private sitting room, she wasted no time. "My brother's sister-in-law's family is going to use you against him. A widow of questionable reputation, living in his house, caring for the baby, they'll paint it as scandalous. They'll say he's unfit as guardian. Then I'll leave," Miriam said immediately. "If you leave, the story becomes, widow trapped a duke with false intimacy and was paid off. That's worse." Lady Selwyn's expression was calculating. "But if you stay, they'll shred you. Unless Alistair makes a public stand, claims you as someone he values, protects you instead of apologizing for you." She leaned forward. "Can you bear that? Can you survive being seen as my brother's, whatever people decide you are to him?" Miriam thought of Thomas's smile that morning, of Alistair's terrible singing and gentle hands, of the way they'd worked together through the long night, partners in the simple, human work of caring for a child. "I can bear whatever I must," she said, "as long as Thomas is safe." Lady Selwyn smiled, a real smile this time, approving. "Then we fight." But that evening, she came to Miriam's room with a different offer. A small purse. Travel documents. A letter of reference. "Leave tonight," she said quietly. "Before tomorrow's family gathering. Before Margaret's relatives arrive and tear you apart in front of witnesses. I'll make sure you're well compensated. You can start fresh somewhere no one knows this story." Miriam stared at the money. Enough to live on for months. Maybe a year if she was careful. "They'll use my leaving against your brother," she said. "They'll use your staying worse. At least this way, you escape unscathed. But he won't. He's a duke. He'll survive scandal better than you will." Miriam thought about Thomas sleeping peacefully upstairs. About Alistair's determination to be different from his father. About the way some families fought not with fists but with respectability, making weapons out of reputation and propriety. "No," she said, handing back the purse. "I claimed motherhood for that baby once. I'll do it again if needed. I won't be bought off or quietly erased." Lady Selwyn looked at her for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, she smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that. If you're enjoying this story, I'd be so grateful for a like and subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories you'd love." 5. The drawing room at Hawthorne House was arranged for tea, delicate cups, fine china, everything proper and civilized on the surface. But Miriam recognized it for what it was, a battlefield dressed in silk. The guests included Lady Selwyn, Mrs. Brackett, the local vicar, 2 of Alistair's distant cousins, and 3 members of Margaret's family, her brother Lord Pemberton and 2 aunts who looked like they'd sucked lemons for breakfast. And Miriam, wearing her best dress, still morning black, still simple, but clean and carefully pressed. She'd expected to be excluded from this gathering. Instead, Alistair had insisted she attend. "You're part of this whether they like it or not," he'd said. "And I won't have you erased from the story." Lord Pemberton wasted no time. "Your Grace, we must discuss Thomas's custody. As his maternal uncle, I have both legal standing and moral obligation to raise him. Margaret would have wanted him with her family. Margaret would have wanted him safe," Alistair corrected. "Not used as a pawn in an inheritance dispute. You dare suggest." "I'm stating facts." Alistair's voice was calm but carrying absolute authority. "Thomas stands to inherit a considerable fortune when he comes of age. Your family has been in financial difficulty for 3 years. The connection is concerning." Pemberton's face reddened. "And what of your situation, Your Grace? Traveling with a widow of questionable virtue? Allowing her to mother your nephew in your home? What sort of environment is that for a child?" "Mrs. Hale's virtue is unquestionable," Alistair said coldly. "She sacrificed her reputation to protect Thomas from exactly the kind of spectacle you're attempting now. She claimed to be the child's mother," one of the aunts gasped. "The implications are scandalous." "The implications," Miriam said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "are that I chose to protect a baby from cruelty. If that makes me scandalous, Then I'm comfortable with scandal. Every eye turned to her. Mrs. Brackett looked shocked that a guest would speak so boldly. The vicar looked thoughtful. Lady Selwyn looked pleased. You have no standing here, Pemberton said dismissively. You're a nobody. A widow with no family, no fortune, no. She has the child's trust, Alistair interrupted, standing. Thomas settles with her. Smiles for her. She knows what he needs. Can any of you say the same? We're his family. Family is proved through care, not blood, Miriam said. She was shaking now but refused to back down. I've been caring for Thomas for days. Feeding him, soothing him, managing his fever. Where were you when he needed comfort? Where were you when he cried? This is absurd, Pemberton blustered. Your Grace, surely you see that this woman cannot remain in your household. The scandal alone. The scandal, Alistair said, his voice cutting like a blade, will be managed. Mrs. Hale will remain at Hawthorne House in a formal capacity, with a contract, wages, and full legal protection. She will help care for Thomas and manage certain household affairs. The room erupted in murmurs. And, Alistair continued, his eyes meeting Miriam's, because she deserves better. She would be my bride. The murmurs continued, but neither Alistair nor Miriam could hear a word as they stared into each other's eyes with something hot blazing underneath.